The tree line looked like someone had taken a chainsaw to it at chest height. Splintered stumps, shredded foliage, a carpet of wood pulp mixed with red dirt stretching 40 meters along what had been a dense wall of bamboo and hardwood. The after-action photographs from 11 Cavalry Squadron, taken sometime in 1969, show a kill zone that doesn't match anything in the usual repertoire. Not artillery. The craters are wrong. Not airstrikes. No napalm scarring. No fragmentation pattern consistent with 500-pound bombs. Something had chewed through that position at point-blank range, low and flat, turning solid cover into confetti. The report lists the weapon system responsible. An M551 Sheridan, 17 tons. Aluminum hull so thin a heavy machine gun round could punch through it at close range. The lightest, most fragile armored vehicle the United States Army fielded in Vietnam, a tank that crews joked would get you killed faster than walking. And yet the damage in those photographs tells a different story. The M551 carried a 152mm gun launcher, the largest bore weapon mounted on any American tank of its era. Larger than the gun on an M48 Patton. Larger than anything the NVA had ever seen rolling down a jungle road. The Sheridan could fire a conventional round, yes, but what did the real work in Vietnam had a designation that sounded almost quaint. The M625 canister round. Think of it as a giant shotgun shell the size of a coffee can, packed with thousands of steel flechettes. One trigger pull turned 100 meters of jungle into a wood chipper. The NVA soldiers who set that ambush along Highway 13 had planned for jeeps, maybe an armored personnel carrier or two. They positioned their RPG teams, laid their command-detonated mines, and waited. What came around the bend weighed less than a truck and looked like an easy kill. If you served on one of these things, or your father did, or someone you knew came home with Sheridan stories, drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe so this channel keeps finding the people who carried these fights. And if this one hits right, like the video so it reaches them. The Flechette round that followed their ambush initiation arrived at roughly 1,200 meters per second. No arc, no warning whistle. A flat horizontal blast that filled the engagement corridor from ground level to about 6 feet high. Precisely the zone where human beings crouch, aim, and fire. The tree line didn't just take casualties, it ceased to function as a fighting position in under 4 seconds. 63,000 pounds. That's what an M48 Patton weighed combat loaded, and it became the defining number of American armor's problem in Southeast Asia. Vietnamese bridges rated for civilian traffic, ox carts, motorbikes, the occasional truck, topped out around 20 tons. The Patton exceeded that by nearly 12. River crossings turned into logistics nightmares, and rice paddies became potential burial grounds, the heavy tracks sinking into saturated soil until recovery vehicles had to drag them out backward like stuck cattle. The Patton could fight. Nobody questioned that. But it couldn't get to the fight without an engineering detail clearing the path first, and in a war defined by speed of reaction, ambush, counter-ambush, pursuit through triple canopy, arriving 40 minutes late with a bridge-laying crew defeated the purpose. By 1967, the Army's frustration had calcified into a formal requirement. General William Westmoreland wanted armor that could keep pace with his airmobile infantry, something light enough to cross provincial bridges, nimble enough to navigate plantation roads, small enough to fit inside a C-130, and ideally droppable by parachute. That last specification tells you how desperate the thinking had become. A parachute-droppable tank. The concept bordered on absurd, and the engineering challenges reflected it. The M551 Sheridan had actually entered development years earlier, back in 1959, under a program called AR/AAV, Armored Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle. The name alone stretched credulity. Allison Division of General Motors won the contract, and what they proposed solved the weight problem through a decision that would haunt every crew who ever buttoned up inside one. They built the hull from aluminum. Not aluminum armor in the modern composite sense, welded aluminum plate, period. It stopped small arms fire and shell fragments against anything heavier, a 50 caliber round, an RPG-2, a command-detonated mine. The hull offered about as much protection as a filing cabinet. Crews knew this. You could hear rounds hitting the side and know exactly what caliber they were by the sound, wrote one platoon sergeant from 3-4 Cavalry. His word for the experience, intimate. The trade-off bought something remarkable, though. At 17 tons, the Sheridan crossed bridges that stopped Patton's cold. It could navigate flooded paddies without sinking to its fenders. A C-130 could carry one. And, with the low-altitude parachute extraction system, the aircraft didn't even need to land. It flew 15 feet off a dirt strip, and the Sheridan slid out the back on a pallet, decelerating across open ground in a shower of sparks and red dust. The whole evolution looked like controlled chaos because it largely amounted to controlled chaos. But it worked. Airborne units at Fort Bragg practiced the technique until they trusted it, or at least until they stopped flinching. So, the Army had its light tank. Fast, deployable, and about as sturdy as a greenhouse. What made it lethal, what transformed it, from a reconnaissance curiosity into the ambush-breaking sledgehammer that shredded that tree line on Highway 13, sat in the turret. The gun looked absurdly large for a chassis that small, a visual contradiction that made you question whether someone had read the blueprints wrong. The breech alone weighed more than some motorcycle engines. When the loader shoved around into the 152mm gun launcher and the breech block slammed shut, the sound inside that aluminum turret hit like someone dropping a manhole cover on concrete, a metallic crash that rang through the hull and settled in your teeth. 4 men worked inside a fighting compartment built for something closer to 3, and the gun dominated everything. It filled the turret the way a grand piano fills a studio apartment. You moved around it, ate around it, slept with your knees drawn up because the recoil guard didn't care where your legs were when that breech came back. The 152mm M81 gun launcher. The designation gun launcher mattered because it did 2 jobs that no single weapon had ever been asked to do simultaneously on a production tank. It fired conventional ammunition, canister, high explosive anti-tank, and it launched the M551's Sheridan guided missile, a wire-guided anti-tank round that the crew could steer after firing using an infrared command link. The Sheridan gave the Sheridan a theoretical kill capability against Soviet heavy armor at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. In Vietnam, nobody cared about the Sheridan. The jungle engagement distances topped out around 100 meters on a clear day. But the gun that could launch it, that mattered enormously because the bore size required for the missile dictated everything else. 152 millimeters, just under 6 inches. For comparison, the M551's main gun measured 90 millimeters. The M60's gun ran to 105. The Sheridan's weapon outclassed both by a margin that looked like a typo on the spec sheet. A vehicle that weighed less than a deuce-and-a-half truck carried a gun with a bore diameter exceeding anything mounted on American medium tanks, weighing 3 times as much. The Army's own evaluation report from 1968 describes the recoil forces as at the practical limit of the chassis. Their phrasing, diplomatic as it sounds, meant the vehicle nearly tore itself apart every time it fired, and it nearly did. The recoil drove the Sheridan backward on its tracks, and crews reported the front end lifting slightly off the ground during high-charge firings. 16.5 tons of aluminum lunging rearward while the nose kicked up. The physics bordered on slapstick if you weren't sitting inside it. The Detroit diesel 6V53 engine produced 300 horsepower, adequate for mobility, but offering nothing in the way of anchoring the vehicle against its own armament. Every shot rocked the hull so violently that the gunner lost his sight picture completely and had to reacquire the target from scratch. Rate of fire suffered accordingly. A well-drilled M48 crew could put 4 rounds downrange in a minute. Sheridan crews managed 2 if things went well, and things frequently did not go well. The ammunition created its own problems. To save weight and interior space, the designers chose combustible cased rounds. The brass cartridge case that conventional tank ammunition used got replaced with a nitrocellulose casing that burned up when the propellant ignited, leaving nothing to extract. Clever in theory. In the tropical humidity of Vietnam, the casings absorbed moisture, swelled, and jammed in the breech. Worse, Fragments of incompletely burned casing lingered inside the gun tube, still smoldering. The loader's job required him to open the breech and shove it in the next round. If a glowing ember from the previous casing contacted the fresh combustible case before the breech block closed, the round cooked off inside the turret. The file from Aberdeen Proving Ground lists 9 premature detonations during the first 18 months of field deployment. 9 times the weapon designed to protect the crew became the thing most likely to kill them. So the engineering made no obvious sense. An enormous gun on a tiny hull, firing ammunition that sometimes exploded in the wrong direction, generating recoil forces the chassis could barely absorb, all wrapped in armor that stopped nothing heavier than rifle fire. The Sheridan looked like a procurement disaster, and by several honest measures, it earned that reputation. What the spreadsheets missed, and what the NVA ambush teams along Highway 13 learned at a cost they couldn't sustain, came down to one specific round in the ammunition rack. Each flechette measured just over an inch long, a nail-shaped steel dart with 4 tiny fins stamped into its tail, weighing about half a gram, light enough to sit on your fingertip without feeling much of anything. Hold one up, and it looked like something you'd lose in a junk drawer. The XM625 canister round packed 10,000 of them into a single shell. The round itself functioned on a principle older than rifling. A thin metal canister, slightly under 6 inches in diameter to match the bore, filled to capacity with flechettes pressed into a resin matrix. No fuse, no timed detonation. When the propellant charge fired, the canister left the muzzle and immediately began to separate, the walls peeling apart from air resistance and centrifugal force within 15 to 20 meters of the gun tube. The flechettes released into a spreading cone, not unlike birdshot from a 12-gauge, except this shotgun had a bore you could fit your fist inside, and the pellets flew at roughly 1,200 meters per second. At 50 meters from the muzzle, the cone spread to approximately 18 meters wide. At 100 meters, closer to 30. The dispersion pattern covered an area equivalent to a tennis court, and every square foot of that area contained multiple steel darts arriving faster than any rifle bullet the NVA carried. The math gets ugly fast. 10,000 flechettes across a 30-meter cone means roughly 11 darts per square meter at maximum effective range. There was no dodging it, no suppressing it, and no digging in fast enough once you heard the shot, because the flight time across a typical jungle engagement distance, call it 60 meters, runs about 0.05 of a second. The sound of the gun firing and the arrival of the flechettes reached the target almost simultaneously. Crews called it the Beehive round, a name borrowed from an artillery variant that the 105mm howitzer batteries had used since 1966. The artillery version worked well enough. The Sheridan version operated on a different scale entirely because the engagement geometry changed everything. Artillery Beehive rounds fired from firebase perimeters at attacking infantry hundreds of meters out, the cone spreading wide enough that individual flechette density dropped considerably. The Sheridan fired its canister at ambush range, 30, 50, 80 meters, where the cone stayed tight and the density stayed lethal. At 40 meters, those 10,000 darts occupied a space roughly 12 meters across. The concentration at that distance approached 70 flechettes per square meter. A human torso presents about half a square meter of frontal area. 35 flechettes per person, each one a steel nail moving at 3 times the speed of sound. The terminal effects described in the medical assessments from 3rd Field Hospital use language that belongs in an engineering stress report, not a surgical summary. The flechettes didn't just wound. They tumbled after entry, the fins catching tissue and redirecting the dart's path through the body in unpredictable corkscrewing trajectories. A single flechette could enter a shoulder and exit a hip. The word the surgeons kept using, devastating. Their word. The click came first. A metallic snap carried through humid air, the sound of a command-detonated mine's clacker being squeezed, the firing device that initiated every NVA ambush along the roads of 3rd Corps. That click preceded the explosion by perhaps 1/10 of a second, not enough time to react, barely enough time to register. Then the lead vehicle, usually a 2.5-ton truck or an M113 armored personnel carrier, lifted off the road surface on a column of brown smoke and dirt, and the tree line erupted. Nguyen Van Tai commanded an ambush platoon in the 7th NVA Division, operating along Highway 13 north of Lai Khe through most of 1969. His unit trained on a doctrine refined over 2 decades of fighting motorized columns, first French, then American. The geometry never changed because it didn't need to. An L-shaped ambush positioned the main assault element parallel to the road, with a smaller blocking force perpendicular at the head of the kill zone. The mine destroyed the lead vehicle, halting the column. The blocking element prevented forward movement. The assault element dug into prepared fighting positions along the tree line, typically 30 to 60 meters from the road shoulder, opened fire simultaneously along the length of the stalled convoy. Interlocking fields of AK-47 fire, RPG-2s, and RPG-7s targeted at anything armored, and at least one heavy machine gun anchoring each end of the line. The doctrine assumed several things. It assumed the column carried infantry and soft-skinned vehicles. It assumed return fire would come from individual weapons, M16s, M60 machine guns, maybe a .50 caliber mounted on a truck ring. It assumed the ambush element held firepower superiority for the first 60 to 90 seconds, long enough to inflict catastrophic casualties before American air support or artillery could respond. And it assumed the tree line provided concealment and cover sufficient to survive that return fire until the withdrawal signal came, 3 green flares, or a whistle blast if the flares failed. Against a standard convoy, every one of those assumptions held. The NVA refined this template through hundreds of engagements across Bin Long and Bin Duong provinces until it ran like clockwork. Casualties among ambush teams stayed manageable. American losses mounted. The roads became so dangerous that convoy commanders requested air cavalry escorts for routine supply runs, and even then the ambushes continued because the NVA timed their attacks for the gaps between helicopter passes. Then someone at division level started seating Sheridans into the convoy order of march. The placement looked random but followed a pattern worked out by squadron commanders in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. One Sheridan rode 4th or 5th in the column, another near the tail, not leading. The NVA expected armor up front and planned accordingly, aiming their RPG teams at the first and second vehicles. Buried in the middle of the column, the Sheridan resembled just another boxy shape in a line of boxy shapes, its low silhouette and aluminum hull not immediately distinguishable from an M113 at ambush distance through foliage. The mine would detonate. The tree line would open up. And then something happened that fell outside every tactical scenario Nguyen Van Tai's platoon had rehearsed. Instead of rifle fire snapping back from the kill zone in ragged individual bursts, the Sheridan's turret traversed toward the heaviest concentration of muzzle flashes, a process that took roughly 4 seconds. And the gunner put a Beehive round into the tree line at point-blank range. You already know what 10,000 flechettes do at 40 meters. What you might not appreciate is what that single shot did to the ambush as a tactical system. The NVA assault element typically positioned 12 to 15 soldiers along a 40-meter frontage. One canister round covered that entire frontage and reached 8 to 10 meters into the tree cover behind it. The assault element didn't take casualties. It was gone. 12 to 15 fighters wiped from the line in a single trigger pull. The blocking force at the head of the kill zone heard the distinctive bass thump of the 152, a sound nothing else on the battlefield replicated, and faced an immediate decision. Hold position and absorb the next round, or withdraw through pre-planned routes that suddenly felt far too slow. Most ran. The after-action reports from 3-4 Cavalry note that blocking elements broke contact within 15 seconds of the first canister round. 15 seconds. The Traverse hand crank on the Sheridan's turret required 14 full rotations to swing the gun 90 degrees. Staff Sergeant Robert Forrest, gunner on a Sheridan designated C-23 riding 5th in a supply column south of Enlock on the morning of March 9, 1969, didn't have 90 degrees to cover. The muzzle flashes came from his 2 o'clock, maybe 40 degrees off the gun's forward position. 6 rotations. He started cranking before the debris from the command mine finished falling on the engine deck. The loader, Specialist Danny Reeves, already had a Beehive seated. Standard operating procedure along Route 13 by that spring dictated a canister round in the breech at all times, a second on the loader's knee, safety be damned. Reeves had the third round cradled against his thigh, the nitrocellulose casing warm and slightly tacky from the heat inside the turret. The vehicle commander, Lieutenant Paul Gruber, stood in the cupola calling the traverse. Right, hold, his voice competing with the noise of AK fire hitting the hull. Aluminum doesn't ring like steel. It thuds. Each impact sounded like someone kicking a filing cabinet, a flat dead sound that carried no echo but told you exactly how thin the wall between your body and the bullet actually measured. Forrest stopped cranking. Through the gunner's sight, he saw muzzle flashes winking along a berm at the tree line's edge, concentrated across a frontage of maybe 35 meters. Individual figures moved between positions. He could see them. They couldn't see him. Not clearly, not as anything distinct from the other vehicles in the column now taking fire and trying to reverse. Gruber dropped into the turret and pulled the hatch shut. The interior went dark except for the sight's green glow. "Send it!" Forrest squeezed the firing handle. 11 seconds had passed since the mine detonated. The recoil slammed the turret backward on its ring, and Forrest's face bounced off the sight pad hard enough to split the skin above his left eyebrow. He didn't feel it. The concussion inside the closed turret hit like a pressure wave in a swimming pool. Not a sound exactly, more a full-body compression that squeezed his chest and momentarily blanked his hearing to a high, thin whine. Reeves already had the breech open, the tube still trailing a wisp of smoke from the burned casing, and he rammed the second canister home. The breech block crashed shut. Forrest reacquired. He didn't need to traverse. The gun pointed at the same stretch of tree line. Through the sight, the berm looked different now. Stripped, opened up, the foliage shredded down to raw white wood. No muzzle flashes along that frontage. None. Gruber came up on the platoon net and reported contact. The radio operator at Squadron asked for a situation update. Gruber said the ambush appeared to have broken contact. Total elapsed time from mine detonation to ceasefire, 22 seconds. The column lost one truck to the mine. No American dead. Forrest wiped blood out of his eye with the back of his glove and asked Reeves for a cigarette. His hands shook badly enough that Reeves had to light it for him. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, sits on a peninsula jutting into the Chesapeake Bay. Flat, windswept, unremarkable, except for what gets tested there. In the summer of 1967, a team from Frankford Arsenal set up a series of plywood target frames across a measured range and fired XM625 canister rounds from a stationary Sheridan at distances from 25 to 200 meters. They photographed every frame afterward. The photos survive in the test report, and they tell a story that Robert Forrest's shaking hands already understood. At 25 meters, the flechettes hadn't fully separated from the resin matrix. Clumps of darts struck the plywood together, punching ragged holes the size of a fist. The pattern covered a circle roughly 6 meters across. Effective, but wasteful. The darts bunched too tightly, multiple flechettes hitting the same square inch of target. Overkill on a scale that served no tactical purpose. The engineers noted this without commentary. They measured, photographed, moved to the next distance marker. At 50 meters, the picture changed. The resin had fully disintegrated. Individual flechettes spread into a cone approximately 15 meters in diameter, each dart now flying independently, tumbling slightly from the rifling imparted by the gun's shallow twist rate before stabilizing fins forward. The target frames at this distance showed an even distribution, remarkably even, the report notes, given the crude packing method. Flechette density at 50 meters averaged 56 darts per square meter across the central two-thirds of the cone. The outer edges thinned to around 30 per square meter. A standing human figure at 50 meters, presenting roughly half a square meter of frontal area, could expect to absorb between 15 and 28 flechettes depending on position within the cone. The report lists these numbers in a table formatted like an actuarial document. Column headers read range, cone diameter, mean density, expected hits per silhouette. Clean, bloodless arithmetic. At 100 meters, the cone opened to 28 meters across. Density dropped to 11 per square meter at center, 7 at the edges. Still 5.5 flechettes per silhouette on average. Each one arriving at roughly 1100 meters per second, having lost only marginal velocity over that distance because the darts' sectional density, their weight relative to their cross-sectional area, runs exceptionally high for their size. A flechette sheds speed slowly. At 100 meters, it still carries enough energy to penetrate a standard steel helmet front to back. The Aberdeen team tested this specifically. They bolted M1 helmets to wooden headforms and fired from 100 meters. Every helmet showed complete perforation. Both sides. The dart entered the front, passed through the interior space where a skull would sit, and exited the rear shell. Complete penetration at all tested ranges, the report states. They underlined it. At 150 meters, the cone spread to 42 meters wide, and density fell to roughly 5 per square meter, 2 to 3 hits per silhouette. Still lethal, 2 flechettes through the torso will kill or incapacitate. But now probability enters the equation. A soldier lying prone reduces his frontal area to perhaps 1/10 of a square meter. At 150 meters, a prone soldier catches maybe half a flechette on average. Survivable odds, barely, if you're already on the ground before the trigger pull. But ambush doctrine put NVA soldiers in standing or kneeling firing positions, crouched behind a berm, exposed from the chest up, presenting 1/4 square meter at minimum. And they occupied those positions in clusters, a fire team of 3 or 4 men spaced 2 meters apart along the tree line. One canister round at 80 meters put 40 to 60 flechettes into that fire team's combined frontage. The probability that all 4 men survive drops below 1%. The probability that any single man in that group escapes without a wound drops below 6%. The round performs as a near-perfect area denial weapon at ranges consistent with typical ambush engagement distances in the Republic of Vietnam theater. That sentence appears on page 14 of the Frankford Arsenal evaluation, dated November 1967. Technical, stripped of anything resembling human feeling. The evaluators recommended full production. Someone in the approval chain initialed the recommendation in blue ink. The name is illegible, smudged by time or handling. Full production began 3 months later. By March of 1969, Danny Reeves kept 2 spares on his knee because one never felt like enough. The floor plate measured 3/4 of an inch thick. Aluminum, not steel, a material choice driven by weight requirements that made perfect sense in an engineering review, and no sense at all when a pressure-detonated mine packed with 20 pounds of TNT detonated directly beneath the driver's compartment. The blast didn't penetrate the hull so much as unmake it. Aluminum tears. It rips along seams and folds inward like wet cardboard, and the fragments it throws carry none of the predictability of steel shrapnel. They twist into ragged shapes that tumble through the crew compartment on irregular paths, shredding equipment, flesh, wiring harnesses, whatever they contact first. Between January 1969 and December 1970, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment lost more Sheridans to mines than to every other cause combined. RPG hits accounted for a smaller but uglier share. The shaped charge jet from an RPG-7 punched through the aluminum hull with almost no resistance. The armor that couldn't stop a 50 caliber round certainly couldn't stop a copper penetrator moving at 300 meters per second. When an RPG hit the turret near the ammunition storage, the combustible casings ignited. The resulting fire couldn't be extinguished with onboard systems. Crews had seconds to evacuate before the remaining rounds cooked off in a chain that blew the turret completely free of the hull ring. Specialist Thomas Crowley, driver on a Sheridan in D Troop, described the sound of casings igniting behind him as a blowtorch the size of a room. He crawled out through the driver's hatch with second-degree burns across his shoulders and the back of his neck. The vehicle burned for 40 minutes. Recovery crews found the turret 19 meters from the hull. So, the Sheridan killed its own people. The cause wasn't malice. It was compromise. Every design decision that made it light enough to swim a river and sprint down a jungle road also made it catastrophically fragile when hit. The aluminum hull that saved 8,000 pounds invited destruction by weapons. The M48 shrugged off. The combustible casings that eliminated the weight and volume of brass cartridges turned the ammunition rack into an incendiary bomb. Crews knew this. They lived inside these trade-offs every day, felt the thinness of the walls with their elbows. They smelled the nitrocellulose off-gassing in the tropical heat. They nicknamed the vehicle the Sheridan Zippo after the lighter, because that's what it became when penetrated. And they refused to give it up. Squadron commanders in the 11th ACR, the 3rd Squadron of the 4th Cavalry, and other units running Route 13 convoys reported the same phenomenon through 1969 and into 1970. Crews offered the chance to transfer to M551's or M48's declined. Replacement crews volunteered specifically for Sheridan platoons. The vehicle that burned like a cigarette lighter and crumpled under mines that an M48 would ride over, that vehicle had waiting lists. The reason sat in the ammunition rack. 4 Beehive rounds and the knowledge of what they did to an ambush kill zone made crews accept a level of personal risk that looks irrational on paper. It wasn't irrational. It reflected a calculation every combat soldier makes, whether he articulates it or not. The trade between the probability of being hit and the probability of surviving the fight. The Sheridan increased both the chance of dying if hit and the chance of never being effectively engaged in the first place. Ambush teams that spotted a Sheridan in the column sometimes let it pass without firing. Word had traveled north along the supply corridors from Cambodia. The crews understood this. They'd rather ride in a glass cannon that terrified the enemy than a steel box that merely absorbed punishment. Danny Reeves re-upped for a second tour in 1970 and requested assignment to the same vehicle, C-23. The request went through. He loaded Beehive rounds into that combustible casing breech for another 11 months, 2 spares on his knee, the hull around him thin enough to feel the sun's heat through the metal. They stopped hitting us on the straight stretches. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Gruenwald, commanding the 2nd Squadron of the 11th ACR, wrote that in his end-of-tour report dated August 1970. A simple observation buried on page 11 between notes about supply requisitions and personnel rotation schedules. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. By mid-1970, NVA ambush patterns along Route 13 had shifted in ways that American intelligence officers found striking. The ambush frequency didn't drop. Not exactly. The enemy still fought, still planted mines, still initiated contact with command-detonated charges and coordinated small arms fire. They adapted the way professional soldiers adapt. They moved their kill zones to curves and bridge approaches where convoy vehicles bunched together and Sheridans couldn't depress their guns below the road embankment. They increased standoff distances, initiating from 200 meters and beyond. Ranges where the Flechette cone spread wide enough that density dropped below reliable lethality. They targeted the Sheridans specifically with RPG teams positioned on the flanks, trying to kill the canister-bearing vehicles before the turrets could traverse. Sources conflict on how organized this counter-doctrine became. Some captured documents reference the Sheridan by its Vietnamese nickname, Con Qua, the crab, and instruct ambush teams to engage it first or not at all. Other documents make no mention of the vehicle. The picture stays incomplete, but the pattern in the contact reports tells its own story. Columns running without Sheridans absorbed ambushes at roughly 3 times the rate of columns running with them through the second half of 1970. 3 times. You can argue methodology, sample size, confounding variables. The crews who rode those columns didn't argue. They counted. NVA Senior Colonel Tran van Dijk commanded elements of the 7th NVA Division operating in the Iron Triangle and along the northern approaches to Saigon through 1969 and 1970. He lost an estimated 2 companies' worth of soldiers to canister fire in ambushes that failed to achieve their objectives during that period. roughly 240 men killed or wounded badly enough to require evacuation north. The estimate comes from captured personnel records, cross-referenced with after-action body counts, and both sources carry obvious limitations. Dak himself survived the war. He gave a series of interviews in Hanoi in 1988 in which he described the Sheridan's canister round as the single most effective American weapon his units faced in the 3rd Corps area of operations, more feared than airstrikes because it arrived without warning and could not be avoided once the ambush had been sprung. He called it a weapon that punished courage, meaning it killed the soldiers brave enough to hold their positions and fire, while those who broke and ran survived. A professional assessment from a professional enemy, delivered without bitterness, 19 years after the fact. Robert Forrest left Vietnam in November 1969. Danny Reeves finished his 2nd tour in May 1971. Lieutenant Paul Gruber rotated home in July 1970. The records track them that far. After that, the file on C-23's crew goes sparse. Reeves submitted a forwarding address in Decatur, Illinois. Then nothing. Gruber's last entry lists a transfer request to Fort Knox, dated June 1970. The disposition block sits empty.